So just to start with, I'll go through quickly some of the impacts that we have seen in the water sector here from the pandemic. And obviously, one of the biggest influences has been in kind of immediate demand, and we've not seen much change in overall demand. But that's partly because there's been, due to home working and everything, there's been a rise in household consumption that was largely offset by a drop in non-household consumption as a result of lockdowns. So early on, that largely balanced each other out. Um, it's starting to come back a little bit now, I suppose, the other direction. But most of the water companies seem to think that a lot of that rise in household consumption will likely be permanent, or certainly long lasting anyway. And in addition to that, we've seen sort of significant shifts in just daily demand patterns. These are now, the day-to-day usages have changed. This is more strongly correlated to weather now. So a lot of the models that had been used to predict and manage daily demand in the network were largely thrown out the window early on. And there were issues with having to try and maintain pressure and service in the networks to adjust for these different demand patterns. And we did see, so that this happened because the initial lockdown in the UK corresponded with a period of extremely hot weather. So as a result of that, we did see a lot of outages and pressure losses because they physically couldn't get enough water into the network to meet this sustained household demand throughout the day. So yeah, this has resulted in a lot of changes in the way models have been adapted to understand daily usage. And we did see some initial impacts on the wastewater network as well, with unfortunate disposal of things like milk and beer because of lockdowns and things like that. But there wasn't, mostly this happened through, there were agreements where businesses would be able to dispose of these things at night when there was less overall demand on the wastewater network. But it did increase the costs on the sort of treatment load in some areas for wastewater treatment systems. But overall, there were these initially fairly drastic shifts in demand, but the water companies did catch up. And as I say, it sort of introduced a new level of flexibility in how they're managing daily demand, and they're considering now how much of these changes, particularly the rise in household consumption, will be long term. There was also an impact on the workforce as well for the water sector. Like every other sector, they also had to shift to home working, and they did so rapidly with their staff. There was a bit of research that's been done recently, and most seemingly in the sector, from those who were surveyed, felt that they were able to continue their usual roles. So the general feeling was that from a workforce perspective, the water sector was fairly resilient to the pandemic and was able to adjust and still deliver the services that needed to be delivered. There were a few issues that came up, as with most sectors, IT infrastructure being slow to catch up. And I think obviously that is one of the things that's been highlighted. I think somebody in the previous session was mentioning how obviously the trend towards digitization of the water sector comes with a trade-off of reliance on IT infrastructure and the resulting vulnerabilities to failures in that IT infrastructure and cybersecurity and things like that. So I think the pandemic has really, really highlighted that since we've had to rely on IT infrastructure so much more. But overall, as I said, the sector was fairly resilient and has, at least in the short term, drastically increased efforts to support the well-being of staff, and again, as with a lot of other sectors, having to deal with stress and managing other caring requirements and things like that. But one of the more, I think, long-lasting and I think significant impacts from the pandemic was in the way it's highlighted these disparities, and this is the kind of thing that we've been talking about. Now, in the UK, it's already been the case for quite some time that household customers cannot be disconnected for non-payment of bills. So all of the water companies in this country do have tools in place to help support customers who cannot pay or who struggle to pay. And there's all kinds of tools that they rely on, but some of them are still fairly controversial. So one company estimated that they have it was something like around 4%. Yeah, it's about 4% of their customers were on these sort of plans or social tariffs, and they're effectively being subsidized, obviously, by the customers who can pay. And that still is fairly controversial. But up until this point, it wasn't really that significant an issue. But now that once the pandemic started to highlight some of the affordability issues that so many households are facing, particularly since water is so essential to hygiene and managing hygiene during the pandemic, it really sort of brought that into the crosshairs and made it, even more of a public concern. And this is going to have some long-term ramifications because as I say, the access to water services and adequate water services is essential to hygiene for not just in the pandemic, but I think particularly during the pandemic. And this will also have some long-term economic impact on the financing of the sector, which is something we've been talking quite a lot about. So what this has shown, and particularly the balance has shifted. And in the UK, there was always the ability to sort of manage the balance of income between non-household customer tariffs and household customer tariffs. And in some ways, they could shift some costs onto non-household customers to offset the affordability issues for household customers. But that's not the case really anymore, because of the shift to home working and so many business closures or restrictions. That balance of revenue is shifting more towards household customers. And still in the UK, a large portion of those are unmetered. And I think across the country, we're at around 40% metering. So the tariff model is totally different. Well, a little bit different. And so, and because of the long-term economic impacts of the pandemic itself, lockdowns, and the resulting likelihood of recessions on the back of that, there's likely to be an increased reliance on the sort of concessionary models and social tariffs and financial support tools. So, and in the UK, we have a sort of a sector that has independent retailers. So wholesale services and retail services are independent for the non-domestic market. And the retailers certainly suffered from that because they were still liable for the wholesale costs. But all of their customers had stopped using anything because of the lockdown. So that was one area where the regulator had to step in and offer specific support mechanisms to the retailers to ease their cash flow during the lockdowns and keep them going in the face of non-household customers simply not being able to afford to pay anything. There have been some resulting delays in asset investment plans or predicted delays, I suppose, in asset investment plans as a result of some of this. And there's been concern about the diversion of public research funding as well, because obviously that's shifted drastically towards COVID responses. And has, a lot of water companies do get income from public research sources, and from an innovation perspective, that's resulted in a significant rethink of what's going to be available. Although that's been offset a little bit by this growing interest in monitoring wastewater for viral load, and there's been a sort of surgence in funding around that. And all of this, of course, is further complicated by Brexit. It's not something I want to discuss, particularly given the uncertainty as over the weekend. But it's the financial picture, complicated as that is likely to be even further complicated because of Brexit. So there's one particular issue I wanted to just bring up, and I'll try and get through it quickly because this was true before. This was all decided pre-lockdown. So Ofwat, the regulator for England and Wales, as you probably know, has this price review process. And before the pandemic, there was an issue that had emerged because in this most recent price round, they had taken a particularly strict stance against water companies in England and Wales. And they had forced a lot of them to lower their bills and increase their spending profiles. So it was sort of well known as one of the strictest price review processes that they had undertaken, again, pre-pandemic. And as a result of that, 4 of the companies then challenged those determinations. And they challenged it on a particular basis, which was around resilience. So Ofwat's argument was that the bills should be more affordable. There was issues with dividends, because obviously the sector's privatized. Dividends being paid to investors were too high, and that there were unrealized deficiencies that could be enforced through this process. But the companies argued that there wasn't enough funding provided in this determination to support particularly long-term resilience investments. And that was despite the fact that they could show in their evidence that customers actually did have an appetite to pay more to support long-term resilience investments. And this is one of the most interesting things about the sector in England and Wales. You know, I think it's been mentioned before about this need to involve customers more and have more educated customers in understanding what they're paying for. And in the UK, that is a requirement. Companies do have to involve their customers quite heavily in the discussions around future financing. And so a lot of them had evidence to support the idea that customers were willing to pay more, higher tariffs, to support long-term resilience investments. And actually, so this, again, this was done pre-pandemic. The argument was done pre-pandemic. The Competition and Markets Authority, which is where these disputes were referred to, has just recently issued a provisional decision on this. And on this particular point, they did kind of find in favor of the water companies in saying that there should be slightly higher bills and slightly more funding available to the companies to support long-term resilience investments. So I think partly that shows the strength of this customer involvement model that we have here, that the evidence of that was strong enough that the Competition Markets Authority agreed that there could be appetite for more investment in resilience. So Ofwat, and I think, you know, I don't know if anyone from Ofwat's on the call, but I don't speak for them too much, but I think that decision, I think, did prompt a bit of a rethink in how they were approaching long-term resilience investments for the companies. And so this is from a report that literally just came out a few days ago, just last week. And they're looking to sort of, now there are consultations on the future towards the next price review process and things. And so obviously these types of issues are now front and center. How do we maintain that balance between affordability, public confidence, and long-term resilience investments? And if there's a bit, you know, the reliance on tariffs, I think, is quite clear that it is going to be a challenge because of the drastic changes in the economic landscape that we're likely facing. So yeah, obviously we've discussed this before in the session, but all in all, it's highlighting the need for non-tariff based models for financing, and at the same time, I think speaks to the strength of involving customers in the discussions around their tariffs and what those tariffs are used for. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.